Let's move ahead now to the other big story. Telecom service providers want to charge OTT players for using their networks. The Internet and Mobile Association of India, an industry body representing digital platforms, has said that telcos' demand for a revenue-sharing mechanism smacks of rent-seeking and would disincentivize growth for OTT-based businesses. Now, earlier this week, founders of more than 120 startups, including Zerodha, PhonePe, Paytm and Razorpay, wrote an open letter to the telecom regulator objecting to these demands, expressing caution against any move towards over-regulation of internet services. Now, amid the row over network usage fee, Minister of State for Electronics and IT, Rajiv Chandrasekhar, has tweeted that India was one of the first countries in the world to ensure net neutrality and push back against telcos wanting to be gatekeepers of the internet. Well, for more on this, I'm now joined by Mr. TV Ramachandran, President at the Broadband India Forum, as well as Mr. Dr. Rohit Prasad, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at Management Development Institute, Gurugram. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Ramachandran, to you first, the TRAI chairman acknowledges, we were in conversation with him, he acknowledges that there are concerns being expressed by telcos, not just in India, but across the world, that OTT traffic has grown exponentially and is causing congestion in the systems, in telecom systems. And to that end, there is a case made out, that's not, of course, coming from the TRAI chairman, but the telcos, that there is a case made out that the burden on our networks requires some amount of compensation to be paid. Mr. Ramachandran.
Thank you, Ashmit. Nice being with you again. And we have heard that. And there are at least 3-4 points which I have to convey in this regard. Firstly, the point is that in asking for such a revenue share, the telcos are actually trying to project from a bygone era. They are talking of the voice telephony era, when we had heavy voice traffic. Voice traffic is charged hugely, and their unbalanced traffic, the network sending to larger networks with more subscribers had to pay interconnection fee. So that was a fair thing in that era. But we have moved on from that era, and the telcos must realize that and adapt to the data age. Here in the internet, there is no interconnection fee payment. Internet has evolved that way completely. It has always been so, because on the internet, the voice or data communication is not the primary aim. The aim is to browse data, content, video. It's a completely different ball game. So we cannot compare what was for a bygone era now. And so that is one first point. Second point I would say is that if you ask for revenue share because telcos have made huge investments, well, they made huge investments by their business case. Did they consult us for making the investments? Did they involve us in selection of the network equipment? Did they involve us in deciding to go for 5G or bidding for spectrum? No, not at all. Now, how fair is it to ask somebody to come and share your cost with them when you have not even consulted them or involved them in your negotiations or discussions? So that's absolutely unfair and incorrect. And third, probably the most important, like you earlier pointed out, India is firmly committed to net neutrality. Since last 6-7 years, repeatedly reaffirmed by both government and regulator. And Mr. Rajiv Chandrasekhar today very strongly put that across. And it is well known that a payment like this payment is called SPNP pay, sending party pays. And that is a clear violator of net neutrality. When that is the case, that was the reason why the European Union, the regulator there,
Mr. Ramachandran,
completely rejected it on that ground. It has been the failure in other regimes also. If we bring that in here, that is again a big...
So let me get Dr. Prasad in also on this conversation. Dr. Prasad, coming to you, you had authored a paper in July of 2023 where you had again raised the point that there is a case to be made for telcos to charge a broadband infra levy of 3%. That is what your report said. I just want to borrow from what Mr. TV Ramachandran had said about comments coming in from Minister of State Meti, Rajiv Chandrasekhar. He says, and I quote in his tweet, that the PM's vision made India one of the first countries to ensure net neutrality and pushed back against the telcos wanting to be gatekeepers. That's the concern being raised on the question of net neutrality. Are we revisiting a debate, an issue that has already been decided in the past?
Thank you, Ashmit. Thank you for having me on the show. And it's always a pleasure and a privilege to share the stage with Mr. TV Ramachandran, a senior in the telecom industry and the internet industry. I wanted to just clarify a couple of things. One is that the report that was submitted to INVICT at ICRIA was jointly authored with Professor V. Sridhar of IIIT, Bangalore. Secondly, that report does not recommend that telcos charge large traffic generating OTTs directly. Instead, it recommends that the government charge a broadband infrastructure levy on large traffic generators for the revenues that they generate on the public internet, not on revenues that they generate through specialized services for which they have entered directly into contracts with telcos. So our recommendation has two objectives, and it's very important to understand that. One is to promote competition in the services layer, for which we recommend functional separation of services and infrastructure. And the second is to promote infrastructure financing. And I'll come back to this point in a second. And we want to achieve these two objectives without violating net neutrality. And that's why we recommend a broadband infrastructure levy. If I may say one more thing, the success of 5G and beyond depends on a quantum leap in physical infrastructure, the optic fiber network, on account of the fact that much higher frequencies are going to be used and smaller cell sizes are going to be needed to support the ultra-low latency and high bandwidth services. Thank you.
I understand. Dr. Prasad, let me ask you a follow-up question then. While you may not have proposed in that report a compensation mechanism for the telcos, that's definitely what the telcos are seeking, at least by way of their submissions before the telecom watchdog. So the question I then want to ask you is a concern that has been raised by a number of Indian startups, the likes of Zerodha, Paytm, they've all written to the TRAI as well. Their concern is, look, and they're essentially, to break it down using the analogy that telcos are number one, they've made the highway, no doubt about that. They're seeking toll from the individual users. Now they're also seeking compensation from the car companies, saying that, look, your cars are causing traffic and congestion on my highway. So is there a case that the telcos can make for charging the toll as well as taxing the car company?
Absolutely. The telecom market is a two-sided market, which requires both OTTs as well as end consumers, to be present on that platform. And in general, in such platforms, it is perfectly permissible for the telco to charge both sides of the market. However, that is not what our recommendation is. We do not want startups to have to pay the telcos. We do not even want the large traffic generating OTTs to pay the telcos directly. We want them to pay the government.
Sure.
So that the government can use
Mr. Ramachandran, we're completely out of time, but I'll come to you, Mr. Ramachandran, for a closing comment. The fact that the TRAI is doing consultations on the subject, an issue which was decided back in 2016, now consultations are underway. We also saw the draft of the telecom legislation, which also included aspects of licensing for OTT players. Do you see the regulatory needle shift towards perhaps more regulation of OTT, which could ultimately relate to this demand that is being made by the telcos that pay us money, pay us compensation for infrastructure?
God forbid, Ashmit, and I hope that doesn't happen. And I would like to add one or 2 points, Ashmit. I must do that. Number one, if you're asking for a broadband infrastructure levy, then what about the infrastructure made by all the OTT companies, the undersea cables, the data centers. Nobody is talking about that. So, and then what about the revenue share? For the revenues I give them? See, OTTs are, by their own admission, Telco's own admission, responsible for 70% of their data traffic. That means their revenues would be plummet down if the OTTs were not there. So really speaking, the shoe is on the other foot. They should pay the OTTs 50% of their revenues, which they get from data traffic. And as rightly pointed out by others, you can't do double dipping. You're already charging for data. And Ashmit, remember that under TRI, they are under forbearance. That means they are free to charge any tariff they want. If they want to recover through more data tariff, it's their lookout. They let the market forces decide. They can't just demand somebody extraneous to come in and pay for them, to subsidize their
Mr.
business.
Ramachandran.
I think this
I'm
is the
afraid
first
I
I've
just
ever...
have to interject there simply for want of time. Simply for want of time, I'm having to interject there, Mr. Ramachandran. Dr. Prasad, thank you so much for your time. But that's, of course, one issue that the TRAI is deliberating on. We're yet to see recommendations being issued. But on that note, let's slip into a very short break. We'll come back on the other side and we'll address the issue. The government has told the Bombay High Court that social media companies can take the final call on whether or not to remove a post, and said that its proposed fact-check unit will be limited to flagging misinformation only against the government. Details when we come back.